I want to bring in Greg Sheridan, foreign editor at the Australian newspaper. And Greg, you've been critical of the deal itself that Boris Johnson's put on the table here, but do you think it now looks like one way or another, maybe it will have to be after an election and another extension, this deal, or something very close to it, is now likely to become a reality?
So, David, one reason I'm critical of the deal is that the deal doesn't actually amount to anything. This is a deal for a withdrawal agreement, and the substantial relationship is still to be negotiated in the transition period after the deal. Most British voters, I wouldn't blame your readers for their eyes glazing over with boredom at this, but most British voters are unaware that even if this deal were passed with no opposition in the House of Commons, what you then get is another 12-month period of negotiation with the EU about the substance of the relationship. Now, it's true that they voted...
Greg, I saw you make this point in the paper the other day that, you know, we've had, it's taken 3 years to get to this point. Can we really expect that in the space of 12 months they can negotiate, dot every I, cross every T on this thing?
Yeah, so almost certainly the answer to that is no. The EU never in its history has done a free trade agreement under multiple years. So even if this deal passes, what you'll get then in 12 months' time is another version of exactly the same position we're at now. The EU won't offer the Brits a proper free trade agreement. They'll demand conformity with EU regulations or tax rates, or they demand that trade disputes have to be sorted out in the European Court of Justice or something like this, because they don't want Britain to have free access to their market, but then to be a low-tax competitor offshore. They hate the fact even that EU members can have lower rates of corporate tax than Germany and France. You know, they threaten Ireland over this all the time. So then you just get this Groundhog Day all over again. And even the vote that said they would have a second reading of this deal doesn't actually mean the deal has got acceptance, because in the second reading process they can pass any number of amendments that they like. So they might amend this deal out of all recognition, and then Boris would again have to go cap in hand to the EU, asking them if they would accept all the House of Commons amendments. Now, I think Johnson is nonetheless in a pretty strong position with the electorate, because he has communicated the proposition to the electorate that he wants to get the bloody mess finished, and his opponents want it to go on forever. Was it on Sky or somewhere else that I saw that hilarious joke from the Bulgarian minister that in the year 2192, Britain asked for another extension from the EU, and no one knows how this tradition began, but it's become a wonderful part of European life, you know.
But do you think, Greg, the idea of no-deal Brexit, which of course Boris Johnson very openly threatened as, you know, when he came to the job, and this was a key part of his negotiating tactic, has a no-deal Brexit now faded away? Is that a less likely outcome?
Well, I don't think the Europeans will refuse the extension, because this is really all of a part of various manoeuvres by people on the EU side and in the House of Commons who don't want Brexit to happen, but who aren't brave enough to look the electorate in the eye and say, we couldn't give a stuff what you voted for, we're not going to allow Brexit to happen. So we all know from our own experience that when a bureaucrat wants to stop a government decision that they're not in a position to stop, the first thing they say is, well, Minister, let's delay. We need to have another review. We need time to, yes, of course we'll implement your policy, but we need time to work out how to do it. And then we're already more than 3 years from the vote. Then after the extension, we're 4 years from the vote. Then there's a potential 2-year extension after that. Then we're 6 years from the vote. Imagine if we had a confirmatory referendum of this withdrawal deal, and then we were still approaching a no-deal situation in 1 or 3 years' time. Then there would be another demand for another referendum. So unless no deal is a real serious alternative, it's never going to end this. It's just going to go on forever and ever. And you and I, David, will be still talking about it when you are completely grey and I am on my Zimmer frame.
I'm getting there. Look, what about Jeremy Corbyn in all of this? If Europe comes back and says, OK, we'll give you a further extension, maybe it'll be till January or the end of January, that opens the window for an election to be held between now and then. Now, Boris Johnson would need Labor's agreement to have an election. And, you know, this has been one of those rarest of things where an opposition has been reluctant to agree to an election because we know where the polls stand. Where will that leave Jeremy Corbyn, do you think? Will he have to agree to an election?
Well, he looks absurd in denying an election. And, of course, what a monstrous piece of constitutional vandalism this Fixed-Term Parliaments Act was from David Cameron. But it is possible that Johnson could pass a simple resolution saying we note the Fixed-Term Parliament Act, but nonetheless we're going to have an election, and he could win that with a simple majority. Other commentators feel that the Labor Party will be shamed into agreeing to an election. I don't really think you can shame Jeremy Corbyn into anything. And why would he agree to an election when he's 15 points behind in the polls? So I think this sort of completely crackers situation we have now where the opposition controls the parliament, or the opposition with all the independents and minor parties and so on controls the parliament, and they won't let the government submit themselves to an election. Who knows? This could persist. I mean, I do think Johnson has been very effective in making the British public very angry about this. So he might get an election, but of course you can't predict. I mean, Johnson's ahead in the polls now, but you can't predict. Anything could happen in an election.
You're right. Once you get into an election campaign, anything can happen. I just want to get your quick thought too. I want to come to the right to know and press freedom issues. I know you get some thoughts on that, Greg, but the Canadian election, speaking of elections, this, I guess, if anything, the polls at least were right, pretty tight outcome, but Justin Trudeau squeaks over the line. He's weakened. He's in a minority government now. I read your piece about this in the Oz this morning. You think we're going to be in for a pretty timid term from the re-elected Prime Minister?
Yeah, I mean, I always confuse him with Justin Timberlake, you know, or Justin Bieber, rather. Justin Bieber. I mean, he's such a woke, ludicrous, weightless, light, you know, inconsequential figure of wokeness and political correctness. But it's very hard to interpret the Canadian election. So the Liberals suffered a big swing against them, and they got fewer votes than the Conservatives, but the first-past-the-post system meant that they won more seats than the Conservatives. So you might say, well, is the electorate happy to go left but just doesn't like Trudeau, who's been involved in corruption scandals and dressing up in silly costumes and so on? But on the other hand, the more left-wing party, the New Democrats, got absolutely smashed. The Quebec separatists did very well, doubled their representation or something, and of course the Conservatives had a massive surge, especially in the west of Canada. Canada looks very divided regionally and very divided altogether. But Trudeau has been essentially a do-nothing Prime Minister, and, you know, his core policy, which is weakness, he's going to be strong in his weakness now. This will reinforce his weakness, I think.
Let's turn to it was the big issue on Monday, certainly, but a big issue generally, and that is press freedom, the right to know, your right to know campaign. We've seen the major media companies do the blacking out of their front pages on Monday as part of this. Not a lot of sign the government's bowing to this pressure and rushing to make big changes. But what do you think about this issue generally, Greg?
Well, look, I am completely behind this campaign. Australia, so David, I hate to reveal my age or anything, but I've been a professional full-time journalist for well over 40 years. I've been writing about national security for that whole time. I've had a lot of experience in the US and elsewhere. There is no doubt in my mind that Australia is the most restrictive, secretive, anti-democratic jurisdiction in the advanced Western world. Government and opposition, Liberal and Labor, are equally to blame for this. When they're in government, the parties behave punitively and onerously, and they've lost all sense of restraint. When they're in opposition, the parties always try to criminalise any leak that doesn't come to them. They are fantastic hypocrites, of course, because all oppositions live on leaks. But they, whenever a leak goes to the media, the oppositions will scream for an urgent inquiry because this is such a breach of national security. David, I've written books about the US-Australian alliance when Australian commanders couldn't tell me about Australian deployments in the Middle East, and the deployments were already listed on publicly available American websites. You can get more information about Australian operations out of the Americans than you can get out of the Australian government. I don't know if you recall, I got one paragraph of a draft defence white paper a few years ago, which was defunct and historic, and the information in it had in any event been the subject of press releases. This became a national security scandal, and I was subject to a federal police investigation. I say that I'm no hero in any of this. This is trivial, but it is Kafkaesque and insane that anybody could regard something like that as a national security emergency. This is an urgent matter. Neither side of politics will take it up of their own volition. I'm very proud of all the media organisations making this a big campaign. We're not campaigning for our jobs, we're campaigning for the truth.
And that's the point here, Greg. Can I ask you, though, about what is a bit of a conundrum in all of this, and that is the whistleblowers need protection, but do you accept that ministers and departments and agencies, we're talking about defence, we're talking about ASIO and so on, if they have a leaker in their midst, they're going to want to find out who that is. How do you deal with that?
Well, not all whistleblowers need protection. I mean, often people leak to us out of motives of malice and mischief, but good on them. And society, the freedom of society rests on this paradox. Within reason, a government has a right to stop people from leaking. But the convention has always been it doesn't prosecute the media for reporting anything that is leaked. But the common sense and core conventions of our society have broken down, and now everything has to be codified because, as George William puts it, politicians have lost all sense of restraint. I had terrific leaks from ASIO in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The official history of ASIO reports that there was a vigorous inquiry inside ASIO to try to discover who my sources were. No federal police, no government ever harassed me about it. Of course, they got a right to be concerned about is ASIO leaking any information, but if they start harassing politicians and journalists, not that we're a protected species, but our function is protected. People don't like journalists, they don't like politicians, but politicians get free speech in Parliament with parliamentary privilege in a way that no other Australians do, and unless you allow the media to report information that it gets without subjecting it to the criminal code, then you've compromised a free society. And we are worse at this than any other country. And there should be protection for whistleblowers who expose criminality and so on. But a lot of people will just leak. That's okay. The government has got a right to try to stop that within reason. But we, as a society, we've abandoned all common sense and restraint in this matter. Governments now, they just go bananas. They persecute people, prosecute people, intimidate people and threaten people, including journalists, all the time, and it's absolutely wrong.
Greg Sheridan, well said, powerfully said. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We'll catch up next week.
Thanks, David.